because we don't believe it's accurate, they dismiss it. But the evidence is still there. And this question is asking, why would these people lie over and over and lie with the same lie or the same message that is Joseph practiced polygamy and had a revelation on the topic? And so that's the question. What is the conspiracy? How we want the denialists to stretch their theory to include a motive for all of these people to behave the way they did. The point is that the historians came up with the narrative, and I know it was vetted, and I'm talking about the gospel topic essay on Kirtland and Nauvoo polygamy. That was vetted through the 12 and the first presidency. So they came up with the gospel topic essay. I gave a slight review. It was vetted through our highest leaders. So that narrative, and all the doctrine and history that it reflects is something that's coming from the church and its highest leaders.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And in today's episode, I have joining me again, Dr. Brian Hales. Brian, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, always, Stephen.
Yeah, I think this will be fun. You've been on my program a couple of times. You're one of my first interviews I had. We did, I think, 2 parts, nearly 3 hours on Joseph Smith's polygamy, and we covered a lot of the controversial issues, shall we say. We talked about, I think, Fanny Alger and polyandry and marriages to teenagers and denials and Doctrine and Covenants 132. And then we did a couple of episodes. You've done a lot of work on the Book of Mormon as well. And it was one of the first interviews I did on the Book of Mormon. And you talked about Book of Mormon complexity and all the skills Joseph would need in order to produce the Book of Mormon. And then we talked about some naturalistic theories. And I told you the other day, me and my wife, we went to Liverpool. We were driving there, so it was about a 45-minute drive. And she's not really big into church history stuff or apologetics. But whenever we're on a long drive, I'm like, oh, come on, let's listen to something. And I was going on Saints Unscripted, and we listened to one of your episodes you did with, I think it was Jake, on like a faith crisis one. And it was very similar to the episode that we did, but I thought you did a good job at, there was a lot of data that you compiled, but you presented it in a way that was well synthesized, that was consumable. And we both found it like quite, oh, this is quite enlightening, because sometimes you can forget like, wow, just how much complexity there is to the Book of Mormon. So people should check out those episodes. I'll link them. But what we're going to talk about today is there's been this sort of resurgence, this movement claiming that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist and not the originator of Doctrine and Covenants 132. There's some big YouTube channels. And I've done an interview with Jacob Hansen, who did a debate on this. And I thought he did a really good job in the debate. But Brian, you're here and you're going to provide quite a strong case with evidence and data to support that Joseph Smith was, in fact, a polygamist. Is there anything you want to say to begin?
Well, I just want to thank you for letting me come back and address this topic. It's something that I had personally tried to stay away from for the last year or so, but in the last few weeks, for a couple of reasons, I felt like I should come out, and your venue, your channel is wonderful. I love the interviews you do, and to be here is a great opportunity. As far as the subject, this idea that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, let me back up just a little bit, because I've tried to figure out why has this become so popular, and I think there's a couple of reasons. First off, polygamy's no fun. It's unfair. Men can do it, women can't. So it's easy to think that Joseph wouldn't do it. We love Joseph. Joseph wouldn't do something that's unfair. Well, that's presentism. We're kind of looking at it through the eyes of our current feelings, not through the idea that the God of Abraham and Jacob, who was a God that at least allowed polygamy, could also restore that practice, which is exactly how Section 132 presents it. But I believe what happened in the church that kind of set the stage for this movement, and we can trace it back to the 1940s and 50s, because back then there were fundamentalist polygamists who were getting a lot of media attention. And I think Heber J. Grant and his successors were looking at all this media attention, and I mean, they're 2-page spreads in Life magazine and other Collier's, other big magazines. And they're saying, look, we're a monogamous church. We're not a polygamous church. We're not those guys, okay? Those are outside of us. And the decision was made, whether it was written down or it was just a tradition, but we're not going to talk about, we're not going to study polygamy. We're a monogamous church. That's our message. And so for decades, we find almost nothing spoken about polygamy, especially Joseph Smith's involvement. And this we find exceptions. John Woodsoe came clean. He was an apostle. He talked about it very plainly in some of his episodes in the 1950s, and you can find other references to it. But really, the church up until the 2000s is just, we're a monogamous church, and you wouldn't even know from the curriculum really that this history was there. And this
Right.
was, I think, originally to separate us from the polygamy, the fundamentalist polygamists of the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah, the church is
And
very much trying to distance itself from its historical past. It no longer practices it, and it's messy, it's controversial, and like you say, they're trying to very much clearly say, we're not these fundamentalists. They practice polygamy. We're not the same church.
yeah, but the problem is, though, in the 2000s, with the internet coming up, not everything on the internet was false, about the church. And so the church has to play a little bit of catch up, and they do with the gospel topic essay in 2014. My trilogy, my books on polygamy came out the year before. But you can, a lot of people, when my books came out in 2013, they're going, wait, Joseph was a polygamist? I've never heard this. And they felt
Yeah,
betrayed. And of course, church curriculum doesn't get to cover very many topics, and you can understand why the controversial topic of polygamy might have been avoided for several reasons. Whatever they were, it was avoided. And so we find a lot of people saying, hey, Joseph wasn't a polygamist. I've never heard this, and I don't like polygamy, and Joseph was a good guy. And so they reason in their mind that, oh, Joseph couldn't have been a polygamist. So I think we've kind of set the stage for this movement to come forward. And if the church curriculum had included references to Joseph Smith's involvement all along the decades, maybe this would not have happened. But
right.
I
I
think
think you
this may
raised
have contributed to it.
yeah, I think you raised a couple of good points because I think when it comes to this polygamy debate, I almost feel like there's two elements to it. One is very much a historical question. Did Joseph Smith practice a polygamy? And it's not really faith-based question. You could view Joseph Smith as a fraud, as a sexual predator, as a pious fraud, or as a prophet who was commanded. So critics would probably agree with us that they would say, yeah, like historically speaking, from the data, from all the sources that there is, that Joe Smith was a polygamist. But there's another element to this movement that they're trying to argue, maybe doctrinally or theologically, scripturally or morally, that polygamy isn't of God. Like you said, we sort of cherish Joseph as this beloved prophet, the prophet of the restoration, and we don't want to think that he practiced something that someone might view or conclude as, hey, immoral and scripturally or doctrinally hard to justify. So then they want to pin it on to Brigham Young, which is what I think might be happening with this movement as well. But from a historical standpoint, I think a discussion can be had, and in some way, it's kind of faith whether or not you believe Joseph was a prophet and he was commanded. But historically speaking, that's something that can be determined from the data and the historical sources.
Well, and I think another problem for Latter-day Saints, and this is very understandable, is that when you hear about Jim Jones or you hear about David Koresh, or I mean, history is full of charismatic male religionists, leaders who gather a group, and pretty soon they're sleeping with their parishioners. I mean, it's
Right.
a pattern that happens over and over. And so for us to look back on Joseph Smith, I mean, there's just this supposition, even for church members, it's this worry that he was a libido-driven fraud instead of a prophet restorer. And we can see why even church members are going to be thinking, oh, what were his motives? How could God do this? And they reason in their mind, and they think that God could never demand this. And he never told us why. There's no church leader ever said, here's why God commanded it. But we have lots of evidence that Joseph said he did, Brigham said he did. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about here today.
Right. I thought could be good because this big controversy or discussion that there now is whether or not Joseph was a polygamist, this happened historically back in the late 19th century between the church and the RLDS church. We won't go too much in depth about that, but it's interesting how it seems to be resurging again. But this controversy or this debate happened back then. Is there anything you want to say briefly on that and why you think, again, it's resurfaced again?
You know, it's part of the slides that I'm going to discuss. It's a great question.
Oh,
And
perfect.
let me just maybe say this, that if the RLDS Church had not been formed in 1860, and if they had not sent missionaries to Utah in 1865, 67, 69, if that had not ever happened, let's say Emma had followed along with Brigham and the sons had come west and were part of the church, the reality is we would know almost nothing about novel polygamy because almost all of the documents, or 80% of the documentation we have about Joseph Smith and plural marriage comes from individuals pushing back against the RLDS missionaries who are saying he was never a polygamist.
Mm,
And if they had never been sending that message out, which of course is the same message as the denialists today, but if they had never done that, these eyewitness accounts would never have been written down. People ask all the time, well, why didn't anybody mention it? Well, they didn't need to. It was common knowledge in Utah up until the RLDS missionaries show up. And then it's like, oh, wait, we better document this. And even in one of I'll add this little story that one of the sons of Joseph Smith was speaking in, it might have been an LDS chapel. I mean, they allowed them visiting preachers to use their chapels, but he's preaching on the fact that Joseph Jr., the martyr, was never a polygamist, and Joseph F. Smith, who was a junior apostle, but he gathered the 1869 affidavits. He is in this meeting, and at some point he stands up and he holds them up and he says, I have the proof right here. Okay, and these were the signed affidavits from so many of the plural wives. And see, that's the context for which this data was gathered. And if those meetings had never occurred, and the Salt Lake leaders knew that these RLDS missionaries were coming, that's when Joseph F. Smith gathered these in the weeks before that. But if that had never occurred, we'd be really left to just a handful of accounts or a couple of dozen that would be really hard to discern any of the details.
mm. So we have the RLDS Church in a way to thank for all of the
We
statements
really do.
and affidavits that we
Yeah.
have. And I think what you're going to provide in this presentation, and I thought Jacob Hansen did quite a good job as well in his debate, is because I was aware before I've sort of like been exploring this controversy over Joseph Smith being a polygamist. I was aware of all the later, journal entries and testimonies and affidavits, and then some of, coming from like the laws or John C. Bennett. But actually, there's more contemporary evidence than what the deniers or even what most people might think there is as well, sort of corroborating the later statements and affidavits and journal entries given. And those things need to be accounted for as well as you're trying to determine did Joseph practice polygamy. So you've got a presentation, and what we're thinking, because this might be long, is we're thinking we might do two parts, perhaps. Part one be you presenting the data and the sources, or like the evidence for Joe Smith being a polygamist, and asking them three main questions to polygamy deniers. And then I have accumulated a bunch of questions from listeners. Some of them are from myself. Some of them I've sort of combined together. And they're either going to be questions related to historical things, whether or not Joseph practiced it, and then some criticisms or questions with regard to doctrinal or scriptural, and just any final questions as well, because we want to try to cover this thoroughly as well. But unfortunately, we can't ask every question to Brian. I got over like 140 comments on my
I
Facebook
read through
post.
some of those.
Yeah,
Yeah, they were good.
but
They
there's
were very good.
there's quite a few that I'm going to try to utilize to be thorough today.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Well, I think if we just to help the audience, I've tried to put together some slides, and if I can share screen,
Yep.
um, are you able to
Perfect.
see that?
Mm-hmm.
Great. And what we'll do is, uh, I first off want to start by just saying, look, the polygamy denialists, I'm going to try to call them that, is in a respectful way. I mean, these are really good people. I've met several of them. I know others, and they have a good point. I mean, they've brought up some really good issues with some of the evidence, and we're grateful for that. I was recently in conversation with Cheryl Bruno, who actually does believe Joseph was a polygamist, but she's been very supportive of this movement, which is kind of a puzzle for me. But she said, to me, did you know that this date is wrong? And I don't remember the exact bit of evidence we were discussing. And I just said, hey, great, write it
Yeah.
up, put it in the Journal of Mormon History, or, put it in a dialogue or a Journal of JWHA or something. It's a piece of the puzzle. If you find a discrepancy, bring it out. Let's talk about it. Like I say, it's an important thing to discuss, but we don't need to just take these little bits of evidence and throw away, so many other pieces. So what I'm
I
saying
think that's a
is
good
that
point.
what's that?
I said I think that's a good point because
Yeah.
I agree with you. I've had Michelle Stone on. I think she's a delightful person. I have nothing personally against her. I don't come to the same conclusions as her. The other guy who has a YouTube channel, I think it's a very good channel in terms of. I think he used to be an actor for the church,
Uh,
Jeremy Hoop.
uh,
He was in Charlie and I think the Testaments. And like you said, like sometimes it's good when people might challenge the scholarly consensus, so you might learn a little bit. But I think what we're here to do is it's not necessarily the us versus them or seeing them as the enemies, but we want clarity, we want truth, and we want to take sort of like the abundance of the data into consideration as well. So I think that's why it's important to address this.
well, and I appreciate that, but I don't want to in any way denigrate them or speak negatively of any one person. They're entitled to their beliefs. In the church, you can believe anything you want. It's the problem comes when we publicly teach things that contradict the church's official doctrine and teachings. We'll talk more about that here
Mm.
towards the end.
I'll
But
just say one comment that one thing I've
sure.
I've noticed a little bit more lately is I think at the beginning the movement was more like, hey, I think there's maybe a discussion to be had. Here's some confusing things. There's some, data maybe conflicting. And I think for some people they've maybe become a little bit more bold in their assertions and sort of claiming that people like yourself or the Joe Smith Papers Project are lying or covering up the history, shall we say. And I think that's maybe where I feel like I don't like when people are calling the other side liars, and particularly when it's the consensus of scholars and historians. But let's just address the data and the evidence that people can decide for themselves.
Well, I think that's really insightful because I was on Michelle Brady Stone's podcast early on, and I can't remember if it's in the podcast or just in our discussions outside of it, but I called her an activist, for the position, and she disagrees. She says, I'm not an activist, and maybe it's in our emails, I can't remember, but she at that point in time, and this would be almost 2 years ago, she didn't see herself as an activist. I would call many in that group crusaders who are trying to change the church's narrative, and they believe they are doing it based upon the rhetoric that I've encountered. And let me just tell you that I have friends in the church history department. I've talked with people who talk to the brethren. The only concern the brethren have about this narrative is how a false narrative is being embraced by the polygamy deniers. If anybody thinks that there's a movement in the church among any of the leaders or historians to change the narrative because they got it wrong the first time, that's a fantasy, that's an illusion. The bigger concern now is that people are embracing a false narrative. But let me also add that what we're going to talk about today is not for the polygamy denialist. If somebody's already embraced the idea, they're convinced Joseph didn't introduce and practice plural marriage, then this is not directed to you. What I wanted to do is to talk about the movement itself and how it compares to other denialist movements. And I've been reading this book about science denying, and it focuses on people who deny that the earth is round. And there's a lot of scientific evidence saying that the earth is round. And it also talks about people who deny history, like the Holocaust deniers. People are denying that occurred. And how the reality is that this approach, these methodologies, people who embrace this are not necessarily always interested in data. It's not a information deficit that's causing their belief. There's much more going on, and that's why we must be respectful and not roll our eyes or think, oh, these people are crazy. Okay, there's other things happening there. We're not going to talk about that. But what he did point out is there's 5 characteristics of these movements, and he even went so far to say, and this is Lee McIntyre, who's the author of the book that I've been reading. He says that you could take this type of methodology and promote almost any kind of an idea, and you will be able to create some followers. And there are some examples of this being that have been done by different college professors. But you'll hear me talk about these methodologies as we move through. But there's cherry picking the evidence. You have a big body of evidence, but the focus is always on just this set of evidence that is favorable to the denialist. There's conspiracy theories, which are used to explain all of the other evidence. Okay, well, this is just part of, you bring in new evidence, new scientific evidence, new historical evidence, and the denialists will say, see how deep the conspiracy goes. They rely on fake experts. There are people up there who will say that they're expert, but when you look at their credentials, they really haven't performed the studies, the scholarship, the research to get into the primary documents or primary science to understand it. And then the real experts they make fun of. And recently there was a video, 8-minute video that was entitled "World's Worst Transparency" as Brian C. Hales. It was to mock me. And it was actually really clever. It's been taken down probably because of negative feedback, but it was very clever, on this. But trying to destroy the messenger of the contradictory message is an ad hominem approach that is employed sometimes. There are logical errors being made, and we can point out those again, some of that subjectivity there. And then this is a real problem. They set impossible standards for the contradictory evidence. In other words, if there's one little date that's off, or if there's one little discrepancy or ambiguity or contradiction, they want to throw out the entire evidence.
Right.
And
Calls
that's
everything
a
into question.
problem. Say that again.
It calls everything into question then because of one little ambiguity.
Yeah, but they don't apply that microscope to their own data, and of course that's the real problem. So just that introduction there. Now, as we move forward, I'm going to ask 3 questions, not to put anybody on the spot, but just to help everybody in the conversation understand exactly what we're dealing with here. And you can download. Here's a QR code, or there's the URL. But I've put together it's 17 pages of data that are surrounding 3 questions that I want to talk about here. And these are the same 3 I talked about on Jacob Hansen's I don't know what you call them, video cast. But here I'm going to give you a lot of slides to support it. So you'll get a different flavor, much more documentary approach to those questions.
And I'll link as well the episode you did with Jacob Hansen. I thought it was a really good episode, but we have the privilege of your lovely slides in today's.
And the first question is, did Joseph Smith ever deny practicing eternal plural marriage, or did he ever refer to polygamy as a sin? And the answer simply is no. And several years ago, I heard rumbles about people saying that Joseph was a monogamist only. And so I put together this article. And here is another QR code. I think I have one more in these slides. But if you want to download this article, you can just scan the QR code. But in this article, I started to gather all of Joseph Smith's denials. And the reality is I couldn't find very many that go right back to Joseph. So I expanded the article to include Emma and Hiram. And then I had enough material for an article. And as if you want, here's a QR code to I put these up on the 23, I found 23 denials. They're in a chart at the end of the article. And I've also posted them here on Mormon Polygamy Documents, a website that I have, with almost 15 gigabytes of data, most of which is affirming Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage. But
I remember I asked you this question the first time we did an episode. I remember it was quite funny. I asked you, and you just gave a very brief response about was Joseph Smith a polygamist, and I remember you saying, like, to those people who say he wasn't, you're just like, I have these 3 volumes, like you said, 15 gigabytes of data, and it's just like, no, all that's trash, all that's lies, all that's part of a conspiracy, and that's what we'll probably talk about more towards the end. For this to work, it would be one enormous conspiracy, and it's like, how do you account for all of this data supporting he was a polygamist.
Yes, we'll get back to that. No, I appreciate that. I think lots has happened. Lots of things have happened since we spoke our first time back when you were just getting
Yes, yeah.
started. So,
And are
uh,
these 23 alleged denials, is that a combination of Hiram and Emma with Joseph? Is that what you said?
yeah. And
Okay.
it's just general statements in the times and seasons. Anything that I could construe to be a denial, I included in the chart. And I wanted to do that because I don't want people saying that Joseph denied polygamy without giving me a reference. And I wanted to make sure I had the reference. So if Joseph denied polygamy, it's on the chart somewhere, or Emma or Hiram. And maybe I should add at this point, just so I don't forget, Hiram did make one statement that does seem to deny that it was happening. Okay. If you want to just base your beliefs on this one quote from Hiram, then I can understand why somebody would say, no, they never did it. Joseph never did it. And Emma was the same way. And we'll talk a little bit more about Emma in a minute, but Emma made two or three statements that are seem to be comprehensive. I
Yeah.
mean, Joseph denied some things, but he's using a coded language. You'll see it. And you may roll your eyes at that idea, but we'll talk about it. But
Okay.
Emma, no. Hiram, no. One statement
They're
from
quite
Hiram, several
emphatic.
from Emma seem pretty direct.
Mm.
And they're in there. They're on the chart, so you can look on the chart. But these are the primary ones that I hear attributed to Joseph, and I just thought we try to go through these kind of quickly. But they're supposed to be the denials that Joseph didn't practice eternal plural marriage, and we'll come back to the term in a minute. But in 1835, the Doctrine and Covenants has a statement there. The statement was put in because for the elders of the church to be able to perform marriages, their church had to have a statute or a policy or a procedure that defined how they would do it. And so this is fulfilling the state law, this statement here. And I have a whole chapter, I think, in volume 1 of my trilogy talking about the history of this section, CI in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. It talks about that one man should have one wife and one woman, but one husband. Now, the verbiage Joseph F. Smith observed in 1903 could actually allow for a man to have more than one husband. I'm not that impressed with that. I think that
Mm.
the real thing that's going on, and Joseph told people this, he said, now we have advanced revelation. It's Article of Faith 9 that we believe in future prophecies and revelations. This was what was going on in the church in 1835. Joseph received additional revelation that changed it. And that's how I would deal with that, even though Joseph F. Smith's observations are kind of intriguing. We do have some statements in the Messenger and Advocate, the Elders Journal. Do Mormons believe in having more wives than one? The answer was no, not at the same time. Well, notice the verbiage here. Do Mormons believe this? Well, no, they don't. They didn't. This is absolutely accurate and true. Joseph could have, the question could have been, is polygamy always wrong? Or is it always going to be sinful? I mean, Joseph could have made a blanket statement against the practice of polygamy in this statement, but he doesn't do that. I
Mm.
mean, he's using
Like,
very
could God
different
ever
language.
allow the practice of polygamy? Because at the time, especially in 1838, it wasn't even being practiced that much. You had Fanny Alger, it would have been before then, but it wasn't really until Nauvoo that he was introducing it to some followers, and they were practicing it in confidentiality.
Exactly. That's the thing. So the verbiage that he's choosing here, instead of making a blanket statement about polygamy being bad or never able to be practiced, he's using other language that is not disallowing it privately, as he tried in Kirtland and will reintroduce in 1841. He always condemns spiritual wifery. Which you can define it any way you want. John Bennett defined spiritual wifery as you can have sex, just don't tell anybody. That's all it was. There were no marriage ceremonies. It wasn't spiritual wifery in the sense that there were wives, because wives would have required a ceremony. There were no ceremonies with Bennett. And then there were people who were not authorized, who were excommunicated. And these are polygamists who were teaching polygamy, but without Joseph Smith's permission. And then we have in October 5th, 1843, and so much has been said about this, and I've written about it. It's in my videos, it's in my books. But there's an entry by Willard Richards, who incidentally at this point in time had been sealed to two plural wives besides his regular wife on October 5th. But he records, walked up and down with scribe and gave instruction to those who are preaching, teaching, or preaching is crossed out. I should have done that. And doctrine of plurality of wives. On this law, Joseph forbids it in the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. And when this was transcribed into the history of the church, there's things are expanded using verbiage from section 132. But the key thing, of course, is on this law. What law? It's not the law of the state of Illinois. This is the law that is described in section 132, verse 7, that says there's one man who controls the sealing authority, and that was Joseph Smith. So he could say, look, we're not going to do polygamy, or these guys are not doing polygamy, but privately he could have allowed polygamy. Nothing in this statement would have prevented him from privately using the law to allow specific cases of plural marriage. And then
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Sure.
Because this is October 5th, 1843. Now, you would know better than me. I thought that John C. Bennett, he was practicing his spiritual wifery. I thought that was like 1842 time period. Do you know who he's addressing here about who's teaching or practicing sort of plurality of wives, but as you said, like not authorized?
Good question, because Bennett is really out of the picture by the middle of 42.
Right,
This is not a reaction to Bennett. And it's really, if you look at the just up above it here, we have other people. Hiram Brown is involved. They're freelance members of the church. They're hearing rumors and marching forward with the idea that you can have more than one wife. But this isn't from Joseph Smith, and there are inaccuracies in the things that are being taught. So this is just a reaction to people talking about it. Joseph at this point is also being accused by John C. Bennett and others of having a revelation. And if you follow the timeline, the revelation is given in July. A month later, it's read to the High Council. Well, you can imagine, once it's read to the High Council, there are rumors that are out. So Joseph is pushing back against people that are misunderstanding the revelation or the rumors about it that are going about Nauvoo.
Right. So you would interpret that as he is sort of preaching against or condemning against those who are practicing polygamy, but it's not authorized, because Doctrine and Covenants 132 says it has to be sort of authorized by the person who holds like the presiding keys.
I think that's how they would have seen it. That's how Joseph saw it. That's how by this time, there were quite a number of other men practicing plural marriage by October of 43. And I document all of this in my book, and there are multiple other authors who have done it, Gary Bergera, George D. Smith, and others. And we document these.
On this law is later sort of like, is it like expanded upon or sort of clarified later?
Right. Yeah. And I didn't bring the slides. I've talked about this so much. People say that Brian isn't addressing the things that the denialists are talking about. Yes, we are. This is an example. It's been addressed over and over. It's just being rejected over and over. And they can reject it. That's okay. But please don't say we're not addressing it, because I think what we're explaining brings us into context, and that their explanations are not in context. But on this law are key words that are expanded in the history of the church when it is published. The most famous one. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine.
What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one. And again, what a thing it is for a man to be accused of adultery and having 7 wives. Joseph could have said, I would never practice polygamy. I know God would never do it. I know polygamy is wrong. That's not what Joseph's saying. He's saying, when I can only find one. This is the language of somebody who's doing it secretly but doesn't want to divulge it. This is somebody trying not to lie, but at the same time not divulge that God is requiring this of the Latter-day Saints, and secretly it's being introduced line upon line, precept on precept to those who can handle it. And so this is not a blanket statement.
I guess he's addressing the accusation of adultery, which I believe this is in response to the Nauvoo expositor. Is that right? Some of the claims by the laws at this time. So that's what he's addressing. Now, as I do read some of these statements, on the one hand, if I was a Latter-day Saint at the time, I think I would read them giving the impression that polygamy wasn't practiced. So I can understand why some might think it's a little bit misleading. On the other hand, I understand that he's practicing it secretly. If they were to go public, bigamy or polygamy was against the law, the persecution would rise. And he's also trying to address some of the charges of adultery. So he didn't view that it was adultery, but that it was sort of permitted as plural marriage, that he was commanded to do it. So he's defending against the charges of adultery, but he's also trying to put down those people who are practicing, as you said, unauthorized polygamy as well. But I can understand on one hand why some people might see that as either given the impression or maybe come across a little bit misleading, some of those statements. I guess, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a very good observation, and I get it. I mean, I don't blame them. This kind of portrays Joseph as not being entirely truthful, and we've built Joseph Smith up to be this almost perfect person. And on multiple occasions, he said, "I never told you I was perfect," but he
Yeah.
also added, "There's no error in the revelation." See, and Section 132 was one of those revelations he would have been referring to at this point when he made that statement. But he wasn't perfect. That Section 132 admonishes Emma to forgive Joseph his trespasses. Apparently, Joseph had trespassed against Emma. If we go back to Nauvoo, we can second guess Joseph Smith's behavior with polygamy over and over. But my message to people is that Joseph wasn't perfect, but he was always worthy. I don't find
Yeah.
anything in his behavior that would have prevented him from continuing as being the prophet, even though he wasn't perfect. And this statement, though, is not entirely truthful, I would say. And again, let's talk about presentism. If our presentism tells us Joseph was this pristine prophet, clean shaven, always in clean clothes, and never losing his temper or being autocratic, that's not the real Joseph. And
Yeah.
yet, if that's what we believe him to be when we read this, we're going to be devastated. And I've talked with several people who, when they learn about Joseph and Polina, they're going, give me back my Joseph that played stickball with the children, who writes love letters to Emma and all of this when there's all kinds of turmoil going on in their marriage through this period. And so again, it's presentism. Get rid of it, get into the documents, get into context. You'll see Joseph is doing the best that he could, undoubtedly better than I could do, and most of us could do, but it may not be a perfect, level of things that he's doing. So
Yeah, I think that's fair.
anyway,
'Cause like you said, yeah, he never claimed to be perfect. I think as you look into church history, there are some controversial or messy or even troubling things, and we don't always necessarily have to defend everything said or done by a past leader or prophet of the church. But I think it's also important because maybe whenever I first would have read these statements in my faith crisis or presented by critics, I would have just seen them as flat out lies, and understanding maybe some of the context as well, what's going on as well, and why he's making some of these statements. But I can understand some people feeling the impression given is that they weren't practicing plural marriage, or it's a bit misleading. But I appreciate that you are addressing these denials, because these would be used by polygamy deniers to say, hey, Joseph always denied it, and we believe Joseph was a prophet, and he wouldn't lie, be fully forthright about it if he did practice it.
well, and I think, as you've pointed out, part of the reason this idea is so popular, not only because people haven't heard about it in the 20th century because it wasn't part of church curriculum, but also if we build up Joseph to be more than he was, then seeing him behaving in this way can be really difficult for us, and that's where we have to have a conviction to Christ and to the teachings Joseph brought forth, rather than to him as a perfect person, because he wasn't. And he declared that over and over. He said, if you expect me to be perfect, I'm going to expect you to be perfect. I mean, these declarations are scattered throughout his talks and things. The last
And a
one
lot of
here. Oh,
Joseph's,
go ahead.
so I'll just say this quickly, this just popped into my head. A lot of Joseph's early revelations, quite a few of them he's getting rebuked and chastened for sins or mistakes. As I read through the history, I think that's one of the reasons why Joseph had to wait so many years to obtain the plates.
Mhm.
There's one account where he was told, I think it's Martin Harris who said this, but the angel told him, you need to quit the company of the money diggers, and you can't lie or steal. So I think in a way that Joseph wasn't perfect, and he had his own sins and things that he had to repent of in some ways. We saw it with the loss of the 116 pages. He got chastened for that. So I think that can be a messy part of history, but it also makes it more real in a way, like to see his humanity.
Good point. Yeah, I totally agree. And just on his alleged denials, it also in 1844 he declared that he had never preached the revelation in private as he had in public, had not taught it to the highest anointed in the church in private. And and these again we're hinging on technicalities here. The highest anointed, these are temple anointings. Okay, they were performed outside of a temple, but he's introducing temple ordinances. They were not taught polygamy. Polygamy was not part of the temple ordinances. I mean, worthiness issues and who he wanted to teach it to later seem to be tied together. But you didn't have to accept polygamy to be part of that initial a group who were anointed. So he didn't preach the revelation to the anointed. He did preach it to or Hiram read it. And maybe again, this is a technicality, but Hiram did read it to the high council. So this is technically absolutely true. And so as we come back to this first question, Joseph never denied practicing eternal plural marriage or celestial marriage or whatever we want to call what he was doing. Okay, but he did consider what he was doing different from freelance polygamy or spiritual wifery, which he did deny, which he did condemn over and over. And we shouldn't conflate what he's doing privately with the fact that he is publicly and privately condemning these other marital experimental forms. So
Okay. Would you
now the
mind if I
second
asked a
question.
very quick question
Sure.
as this ties in? I'm sorry, I won't interject too much or else this will take all day.
No.
But one question a listener had, so I think you could address this quickly. It's about John C. Bennett. And sort of the question is, you've kind of already touched on this, spiritual wifery versus what Joseph Smith was doing, plural marriage. But some people, the question is, was John C. Bennett, was he a polygamy insider or not? As he seemed to know about the revelation and be able to identify some of Joe Smith's wives, but then he was excommunicated from the church, kicked out of Nauvoo, signed an affidavit saying that Joseph had no part in his adultery. And then some critics say, like, could Joseph and John C. Bennett have been almost like in cahoots together, sort of doing the spiritual wifery? And then as soon as it became public, what John C. Bennett was doing, Joseph had to condemn it publicly. And then Joseph's became much more like religious. He had a ceremony and became a lot more about sealing in the next life. And I think John C. Bennett makes some of those allegations. What would be your response to that? That John C. Bennett was an insider, they started together, and then as it went public, then Joe Smith has to condemn what he's doing.
Great question. Very important question. And before my books and an article, I wrote a very long article on John Bennett. It was published in the Journal of Mormon History, 2012, maybe 11, somewhere in there. And it's a full chapter in volume one or two, I can't remember. But uh, Bennett was close enough to hear rumors, but in a letter in 1843, I'm going to reference it here in a minute, but he is writing to the Iowa Hawkeye and he's heard about the revelation. Okay, October 43 letter, and the revelation was given in July. Okay, this is the revelation is given a year after Bennett's gone. Okay, but he hears about the revelation, not sure from whom, and he says, this eternal marriage, this marriage for eternity, is not the spiritual wifery that I was doing in Nauvoo. So here he's admitting, because Joseph was teaching plural marriage in the context of eternal marriage from the very beginning. Everybody
Right.
agrees on that. There's nobody questioning that. They came together, and Section 132 makes this pretty plain as well. So the idea that Bennett didn't know about eternal marriage until he heard rumors about the revelation is a pretty good indication he was not a polygamy confidant, because all of Joseph's marrying, especially the early ones, were just for eternity only. I mean, it's an
That's true.
eternity marriage with the practice and principle of polygamy, which may or may not be allowed or commanded. And that's the context. It's all being introduced, but Bennett didn't know that. He didn't know about eternal marriage until over a year later. So he's admitting that he really wasn't a confidant.
Right, that's a good point. And you're saying that Joseph Smith's early sailings in 1841, 1842, a lot of them were to women with living husbands, and a
Yeah.
lot of them we believe were just sailings. So you're saying that Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy was always tied to sailings in the next life, whereas John C. Bennett, his spiritual wife is basically like, we can have sex as long as nobody knows about it, and he's admitting And was that a letter you said that, or a document that he wrote, that that's not the same as what Joseph talks about in that revelation?
Yeah, it's to the Iowa Hawkeye. It's published. Great source, you know.
Okay, that's
So,
good clarification.
yeah, we'll reference that here in a minute. But we're now going to the second question. This is a question again to pose to the denialists. Can you explain the conspiracy that created such a diverse group of individuals, believers, antagonists, and apostates, to work so long and so hard to portray Joseph Smith as a polygamist? And in the handout, if you've downloaded the PDF, it's the 17-page one. There are 5 different categories. I'm just going to briefly talk about 4. I'm grouping the first 2 together. But what we find here, and again, let me emphasize, we're not asking people to assess the accuracy of the statements, because there's a pattern that when we have the evidence from any of these 4 groups, that the denialists will come in and find some technicality and say, we don't believe that. Denver Snuffer doesn't want to deal with any evidence after Joseph's death. June 27th, 1844. Well, most of the evidence comes after. We've got about 24 or so that are contemporaneous, and we'll talk about those. But most of the stuff comes later. But by just saying we're not going to do it because we don't believe it's accurate, they dismiss it. But the evidence is still there. And this question is asking, why would these people lie over and over and lie with the same lie or the same message that is Joseph practiced polygamy and had a revelation on the topic? And so that's the question. What is the conspiracy? How we want the denialists to stretch their theory to include a motive for all of these people to behave the way they did. When it comes to historical reconstructions, typically the theory that accommodates the greatest amount of evidence, with some good rationale and plausibility, that theory is going to be the most persuasive. And yet, if we have a theory that just explains, the so-called denials and that's about all that it stretches to, that's going to be less persuasive. So here we're asking the denialists to stretch their theory to give us a plausible motive for why all of these groups, as we'll talk about, gave the messages that they gave in the way that they gave them, because we have contemporaneous evidences and artifacts. This is the first group, and here we have this is the Kingsbury copy. Can you see it?
Yeah.
This is the Kingsbury copy of Section 132, and I've made this video. It took me a few minutes, because you can see this on the Joseph Smith Papers Project website, and then I just turned it into a PDF that can be thumbed in front of us, so you can see. There's no evidence that this is forged or that it's been heavily edited. There's some small edits here and there. It looks like he was writing faster towards the end because there are a few more mistakes. But overall, this is the Kingsbury copy of Section 132. It's very exact to how it reads today. And what we find is this one document has a wonderful provenance. And a couple of weeks ago, somebody messaged me on Facebook and said, what is the one incontrovertible evidence Joseph was a polygamist? And I thought, that's easy. It's this document. And it is because we have eyewitness testimony and affidavits from William Clayton, who wrote the original, saying that this is an exact copy. And then we have Kingsbury's handwriting and an affidavit from him saying this is an exact copy. But we have other contemporaneous evidences that talk about this revelation, and I want to just, we're going to be too long here. Let me just read through these quickly. Joseph's journal records a revelation was recorded on July 12th. And Clayton and Hiram Smith are there. Clayton's journal for the same date says it was about polygamy. And then we find that we have this Kingsbury copy. The paper goes back to Nauvoo era. We have a reference in Franklin Richards' essentially his journal saying that Hiram was before the High Council on August 12th discussing the topic of polygamy. There are private letters from just rank and file members that have heard about a revelation on polygamy that Joseph received. We've got the 3 affidavits in the expositor, and we shouldn't think that just because somebody's antagonistic that they're also every word that comes out of their mouth is a lie.
Right.
This is a problem, and sometimes that methodology is employed by the denialist. Austin Coles was a good guy, and he gives a very a detailed account about how Joseph or Hiram actually read the revelation. And William Law says, I took it home. And Jane Law is also uh, validating that. And then we have the reference to the IO, that letter that I mentioned, October 28th of 43, is where Bennett says that Joseph has received this revelation on eternal and plural marriage. So these are contemporaneous evidences corroborating that Joseph had this revelation. And then we have this slide that just shows what happened to it. Well, the Kingsbury copy was commissioned by Newell K. Whitney. Bishop Whitney collected Revelation. He had quite a collection, more than anybody else. And he kept that until 1847. In the meantime, Willard Richards makes a copy. We have that. We don't know when it was made. And then we find that we have in Horace Whitney, that's Newell's son, is asked to make a copy. And he makes 2. And then the original Kingsbury copy, again, the Clayton copy is destroyed, and we could talk about that. That's a separate, discussion point. But then we find Brigham has it from 47, and he publishes it in 1852. Now, there may be small discrepancies and things, but we have eyewitness testimony that every one of these steps is accurate, and that this is exactly how Section 132 came to be, and what the documentation that it's based upon.
Right, so you're actually showing there's quite good provenance for D&C 132, because this was one question somebody had, and you hear it a lot, is they say, like, if this was like a real authentic revelation, why was it not released until 1852 to the saints, and then why was it not canonized until 1876? And I think a lot of polygamy deniers as well, they have to throw William Clayton under the bus, because he is very integral, because like you showed in the previous slide, in July 12th, was it 1843, in Joseph's journal and William Clayton's journal, he's talking about a revelation being received. And specifically in William Clayton's journal, which was written at the time contemporaneously, he is saying it was with regards to having many wives and concubines, with regards to polygamy. So this was written at that time. And so if this wasn't from Joseph Smith, then you'd have to say that they came up with this conspiracy at that time. Like, that just doesn't make a whole ton of sense.
Well, and they made an 8-page document, and Section 132 has some eloquence in it. It's expansive. I mean, and it has specific things for Joseph's time. To fabricate that in 1852 would not have been an easy thing to do.
And with that as well, I remember Jacob Hansen showed this really well in his debate, was the Nauvoo Expositor, the statements and affidavits from William and Jane Law and Austin Carles. And it was absolutely apparent to me that they had read the revelation. You could see textual quotes and specific elements from D&C 132 that they're talking about. Like, it was so specific that it's obvious that there is a textual relation between Doctrine and Covenants 132. And if their affidavit came in 1844, it kind of conclusively shows D&C 132 originated before then, because if you believe that it was later forged by Brigham Young, then is he drawing upon their statements in the Nauvoo Expositor to later create Doctrine and Covenants 132? And then what are they giving their affidavits about then? Like, it doesn't make any sense, that theory.
Okay. Yeah, you've summarized it really well. I mean, it truly is a rock solid evidence that Joseph Smith was involved. It mentions his plural wives. It mentions the controversy with Emma and polygamy, and it's all there. But
Yeah.
that's not all. We have at least 9 other contemporaneous evidences. You mentioned William Clayton's journal, and it's going to be published. I learned a number of things about it. When I was doing my research, I asked Elder Jensen, the church historian, he was a member of the 70, I said, can you let me see the journal? And he said, I would, but we don't have it. It was in the first presidency's vault. It was in the a year or two later, it was given to to the church historians, but I really didn't have any credentials, as an amateur historian at that point. And Laurel Thatcher Ulrich did see it, and so did James Allen, other historians. And I asked the question in the JWHA session that was done in September about how much of the polygamy discussion has been extracted already from the journal, and they said all of it, except maybe one short sentence or something. And the take home is that when the journal is published, it's not going to have any great revelations on Joseph Smith and plural marriage. We've got all that material. But what it did show is that he recopied portions of the journal into other journals. There's more than one journal, and I don't have it all clear in my head. I'm not too worried about it because the areas that are copied are not just one single entry, like they've just taken the July 12 entry and just inserted it there. That's not it. A full set of days is been recopied. And when asked, the Joseph Smith Papers historian said, this is a Nauvoo journal. The daily entries correspond to multiple other sources of what's going on in Nauvoo. So if somebody is fabricating this in 1852 or something to try to corroborate the revelation, they're going to a ton of work. They're not just fabricating, backdating one single entry. They're doing, days and days and days, and with specifics about polygamy and things that are going on that can be corroborated from other sources. So again, as Clayton's journal comes out, I know that the denialists don't like it, but they're going to really have to struggle to explain why somebody would lie so much. What would compel somebody to, and let me make the statement, many of these people are highly devoted to Joseph. If Brigham had come along, even with great threats, and said, I want you to misrepresent Joseph Smith, I don't think they'd have done it. I don't think they would have. And I think if some of them would have divulged or exposed the conspiracy, but we'll talk about that more in a minute.
That's a good point. I agree with you on that. That is a good point. Like, a lot of the early followers would have been very loyal to Joseph Smith and likely wouldn't have gone with this conspiracy. And if they did, you think somebody would later say that I was part of this conspiracy and they feel guilty about it.
Yeah, the fact that nobody spilled the beans after the fact that there was a conspiracy is, I think, a pretty good indicator there was none. But we'll come back and talk about this. But we do have journal entries. One's in Taylor's shorthand in Joseph Smith's journal. One's in Masonic cipher in Brigham Young's journal. We have some crossed out in Wilford Woodruff's journal. We have entries in the Lot family Bible. All corroborate Joseph Smith's sealings to plural wives. And then we have lists of plural wives that converge on different names listed by John Bennett in October of 42, Oliver Olney's book and his notes, which are available. Thomas Bullock wrote a bunch of these. Let me just show you. Here's Bennett's book, and here's where he identifies many of Joseph's spiritual wives, and he gets several of the names correctly, at least when they correspond to other sources. Here is Thomas Bullock's list, and this was written as early as September of 43, I think it was, or maybe it was after Joseph's death, before 1845. But again, another list probably contemporaneous with Joseph Smith. So anyway, that's all of the contemporaneous evidences that I have. There's over 20. So if people want to say we're only going to believe stuff.
Sorry, I was just going to say those are two different lists. Contemporaneous. I doubt John C. Bennett, and who was the name of the other one? Sorry.
Thomas Bullock.
That they would have collaborated with each other, so they would probably be
right here
independent. So if you're a polygamy denier, you would have to say that Brigham later utilized those lists and then asked those women to then pretend to be Joseph Smith's wives and to give affidavits and journals. I guess that's what you'd have to go with, which again doesn't make much sense to me.
It represents a lot of work if somebody's actually trying to do that. So and again, I apologize, we're going, this is getting long. I hope your listeners are hanging in there. We'll try to go quickly, but here's another QR code, and this I've distributed before, but I have over 130 accounts from more than 70 eyewitnesses. Most of these are Utah Latter-day Saints, and you can look at all of those. But one group of documents I already mentioned was Joseph F. Smith, in 1869, 1870 came together. This is a busy slide here, but the pages of the affidavit books 1 and 4 talk about they are signed affidavits about that validate or describe Joseph Smith's involvement. Here's one for a guide for books 2 and 3, and then there are a bunch of just free affidavits on sheets. And it is true that if we look at them, many of these are pre-written. But I verified the signature on many of these with other signatures that the woman has, not all of them, but several of these. And a criticism could be that these are pre-written, but why would the women sign them? Well, Brigham was threatening me. Well, maybe not the strongest theory, but we do have, as we'll see in a minute, a lot of affidavits and testimonials that are gathered afterwards. So these are just looking at some of these affidavits. And here's one where she's dictating to the scribe, because it's obviously not something that had been pre-written because of the content here. And then we have others that are free-written. This is Howard Correa, who had very nice handwriting and did some other writing. He writes a very long one, signs it. There's the affidavit stamp. So again, we have a lot of affidavits. They're not all pre-written. They're all signed. And for the denier, they've got to explain, maybe they can haggle over the accuracy, but why would these people go along with what is allegedly a lie, a deception? But then Brigham Young dies in 1877. In 1886, almost 10 years later, Andrew Jensen comes onto the scene. He writes this article on plural marriage. And in order to write that, he comes up with all kinds of data. And actually, I didn't put the slide in. I thought I had. It's on the handout if you look at it. But I've got a summary of all of the content of the article, as well as the content of his private notes. But here we have another piece of the puzzle. And what's happening here is Andrew Jensen is writing in his private notes a list of Joseph Smith's plural wives. And he's visiting Nauvoo polygamists who are still alive in 1886. And I'm indebted to my dear friend Don Bradley, who figured this out, because he's looking at this. I asked him to, he told me about them and we chatted. And I said, go back and transcribe them and figure out whatever you can about this. And we're grateful to Mark Ashurst McGee and Robin Jensen, who at the Church History Department, Joseph Smith Papers, were able to put us onto this. The church is helping with our research in 2007, 2008. But what's happening here is that we have Andrew Jensen's handwriting for 13 plural wives, and then the handwriting changes. And Don gets an idea, okay, who's writing here? And he arranged for me to come down, and we had Jill Durr, who was an expert on Eliza Snow's handwriting. She's written books about Eliza. And she came down and looked at it and said, yeah, that looks like Eliza, all right. And so what apparently happened in this interview is Andrew Jensen hands the paper and maybe the pencil, or maybe Eliza had her own pencil, but she adds 13 other names here. And you can see the name of Fanny Alger is right here. Most people wouldn't even have known about Fanny Alger. Benjamin Johnson was still alive, but if she had not put Fanny's name here, Fanny may have just disappeared from our historical memory. But
that was 1835, 1836 in
right.
Kirtland. And I believe Eliza was around at the time as well. I can't remember if she was roommates with Fanny but she was close by. So it's interesting that she added her to the list.
Well, Andrew Jensen wrote that Eliza was well acquainted with Fanny. She was there. Eliza was teaching school either in the same house or nearby as where Fanny Alger was working as a domestic in the Smith family home. And so we have, convergences again. Showing an amazing lie, an amazing deception, or maybe these people are, as I believe, telling the truth. But the question that I'm asking is not the accuracy of the list. It's okay. We've got Eliza. She's over 80 years old. She dies the next year. She's feeble. And here she is trying to help out Andrew Jensen with this list. And according to the conspiracyists, Eliza is just conspiracist theory. Eliza is taking this and she is fabricating or lying about all of these names of women who were sealed to Joseph Smith in some capacity. To me, I just that's a hard thing for me to get my head around, that in that setting she would lie so blatantly. And so I offer that again as as another one of the evidences.
Yeah.
If we go forward, though, again, these are people well after Brigham Young is dead. We have the Temple Lot depositions. These are really old people. And yet we have testimony from Melissa Lott saying that she roomed with Joseph Smith. We have Emily Partridge saying she had carnal intercourse with Joseph, and we have Lucy Walker saying that she was his wife, that he was her husband. When they're trying to find out if the marriage was consummated, the language implies that very strongly. The question about sexuality, I did look at some of the questions that were being posed on your Facebook post, Stephen, and great job with that. The evidence of sexuality is very strong in these three women because we have firsthand testimony under oath that they were sexually involved with Joseph. There's some moderate evidence for a number of other wives, weak evidence for a couple more, and then little or no evidence for all of the rest. And the fact that we have so little evidence is sometimes interpreted that it didn't happen at all. People will say there's no evidence that Joseph Smith had any children. That isn't true. So let's talk about a couple of things. Mary Elizabeth Rollins said on more than one occasion, I know that Joseph Smith had 3 children. They told me. I think 2 are living today. I don't remember the date of this. It would have been late, 1880s, 90s. I think 2 are living today, but they are not known as his children as they go by other names. And then we have this account from George A. Smith. While calling upon the prophet one evening about 11 o'clock, he was out on the porch with a basin of water washing his hands. I said to him, what is up? Said Joseph, one of my wives has just been confined, and Emma was the midwife, and I have been assisting her. And so if somebody says there's no evidence of children, that's simply false. There is evidence. These 2 accounts, or the multiple accounts from Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, those constitute evidence of children. Okay, they're just not DNA evidence. DNA testing has ruled out the eight that have been tested. Ugo Perigo tells me now that the previous generation is gone. Finding any offspring is really unlikely because with every generation it dilutes 50%. And we may never have any, but it wouldn't surprise me if we did.
Right. Can I ask one quick question? Because I'm thinking about, I hear this a lot from critics. It was on your previous slide about, was there sexual relations? And you said for some, we have strong evidence with some of the affidavits, for some, moderate evidence, and for some weak. And likely some of the marriages were likely eternity sealings. That's how you would view most of the polyandrous ones, and likely also the sealing to Helen Mar Kimball. And I would tend to agree. I think it's either ambiguous or it tends to link towards that these were just sealings only. But critics might argue, they might say that one, all polygamous marriages are marriages. So sex is always sort of entailed. And one of the main purposes in Doctrine and Covenants 132 is to multiply and replenish the earth, to bear the souls of men. So even if we don't have statements or evidence, it's obviously entailed. It's obvious if these are plural marriages that there are likely be sexual relations. What would be your response to that?
Great question. The response, though, is pretty straightforward. Verse 63 of section 132 tells us that one of the reasons is to multiply and replenish the earth. It implies sexuality. However, a more important reason for sealing in marriage is in verses 16 and 17. It tells us that people that aren't sealed in an eternal marriage live singly and separately without exaltation in their saved condition to all eternity. And that is a form of damnation. And so every person who is exalted will be married in an eternal marriage, not a plural marriage. Plural marriage is not needed for exaltation. And that's plain from verses 19 and 20 of section 132. Exaltation is promised to a monogamous couple who are sealed by proper authority, not freelanced authority, but proper authority, and they live worthily. But the point is that sex is part of it, but it's not the most important thing. And if we look at these women who are sealed to Joseph Smith, who have legal husbands, okay, several of their husbands were not active Latter-day Saints, so they needed an eternal husband, and that made sense. Now, some of them had active Latter-day Saint husbands, and I don't understand why Joseph just didn't send the woman back to be sealed to her legal husband who was an active Latter-day Saint. But the point is, these women valued that sealing, and so going forward without sexuality made perfect sense. And let me just add that my friend Todd Compton has written a very fine article on the topic of eternity only sealings, and he kind of concludes that no, there were never any such thing. And what he's saying is that he believes Joseph Smith lived polyandry, simultaneous husbands. The problem with that is if Joseph had done that, I argue it would have been the most controversial thing he ever did, because the Bible condemns it. Romans 7, verses 2 and 3 declare if a woman has two husbands, it's adultery. So, in that context, to portray Joseph as just marching around saying, oh, I can be your second husband. Let's go, have this sealing, and then I can sleep with you tonight, and you can go to your legal husband and sleep tomorrow night. That kind of a scenario would have been adultery unless there's some really powerful argumentation to change that revelation. But there isn't any. And nobody's talking about it. Even the critics are not complaining about it, even though they know about it, because Bennett mentioned some of Joseph's spiritual wives were married, and at least 20 people in Nauvoo were part of these marriage ceremonies, sealing Joseph to legally married women. And yet we're supposed to believe that he's practicing polyandry, and nobody said boo about it. I don't think that's realistic. I think the fact that nobody is reacting is because they know these are spiritual, non-sexual marriages, and they're not controversial. And again, the fact that nobody's mentioning it is a new piece of that puzzle that needs to be integrated. And my friend Dan Vogel has done 3 videos on how he's sure Joseph was a second wife practicing simultaneous husbands, but he never once mentions why nobody complained about it. The elephant in the room of that whole argument is, okay, if this is such a big deal today, we're making videos and writing articles and things. Why didn't anybody at the time think it was a big deal? Because none of them did. Sorry, got off topic there, but the polyandry is a real issue. And I understand the concerns about it, but I think we need to expand that dialogue to include the reality that nobody seems to be worried about this, including the critics.
Yeah, and one thing that popped into my mind, I do agree with you. I think there's at least evidence, strong evidence for some of the marriages that they were likely just sealings. And even if I were to become a critic and believe it was libido driven, like you would know the name of this person, but there's one woman, Ruth Sayers perhaps, who had a non-member husband, and it was very clear in that case it was like she's still going to live with her non-member husband, but she's going to be sealed to Joseph. The husband approves of it. I think there's another account of an older woman in her 50s who doesn't want to get married, and I think Joseph and Brigham are having a conversation. He's like, you don't understand the doctrine. I'm going to seal myself to you. And it's very clear in those instances that it's a sealing. It doesn't seem like there's any sort of sexual component to it.
Yeah, that was Fanny Young. That's Brigham's sister, is just sealed to him. And yeah, no evidence of sexuality there.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Well, and let's see, getting back to the, I also wanted to share this because it's so easy to describe or think of Joseph as a libido-driven fraud. Okay, even for members, when they hear about polygamy, it's hard to get past that. Well, let's talk about what kind of a person Joseph Smith was as he's practicing plural marriage. Emily Partridge said this when asked if during their year-long courtship period, did Joseph Smith ever lay his hand on your shoulder or put his arm around you or offer to take your hand? Emily Partridge testified he never did, for he was not that kind of man. He was a gentleman in every way and did not indulge in liberties like that. And the reason I mention this is that there's one person who portrays Joseph Smith trying to kiss Sarah Pratt, trying to kiss, was it
Nancy Rigdon, was it?
Nancy Rigdon, right? Thank you. And Brigham Young trying to kiss Martha Brotherton, and it's John Bennett. John Bennett in all of these accounts has these men trying to kiss these various women, and yet we don't have any independent documentation that Joseph Smith is acting like a libertine, especially before a sealing. And this statement here is good. Here's one from Brigham. He said, Joseph never allowed the 12 or any man. We brought the girls home after 2 years' mission to England and paid their passage, but did not touch them nor put our arms around them. So we find in Joseph Smith, these really are marriages. These aren't just an excuse for expanded, sexual opportunities, these kinds of things, that it's a very strict plan. It's according to the law of chastity. See, when Joseph Smith is practicing plural marriage, he's also introducing the temple ceremony. and we can read about the covenants, and they were there then. They are in the temple today. One of the higher covenants is the law of chastity. Can we imagine Joseph Smith acting as a libertine in the guise of polygamy and then teaching these temple covenants at the same time secretly? Again, that it doesn't fit, I think, a very cohesive reconstruction.
Right, and you've already sort of addressed the children argument. You said that there's a couple of statements we just don't have any DNA tested children from Joseph. But one question someone had is that Brigham Young's polygamy, and once they got to Utah, loads of children came from polygamy. Is it correct that he had 56 children? This is just what it says in the question. I knew he had around that in terms of wives, but they might argue, why is there so many children in Utah? But then even if there was like one or two children, but we don't have DNA evidence for that, why so few children in Nauvoo? Maybe you could speak to that. Why wasn't there as many children as we see later in Utah?
Well, again, it's a good concern, but the timeline is very helpful. See, Joseph Smith, by my calculation, was being sealed to legally married women in non-sexual relationships clear up until the angel came the third time, and we have a date for that from Mary Elizabeth Rawlins. It's early February of 1842. His sealings before that reflect this. I'm just going to get sealed to these legally married women for eternity. I think Joseph is doing that because he doesn't want to hurt Emma. That's how I read it. I think he's trying to appease the angel on one hand and not offend Emma on the other, because he knows how Emma's going to react. The angel comes a third time. He brandishes a sword. And so Joseph is saying, okay, I guess we're going to go ahead. Only after February of 1842 do we find him proposing to single women consistently. And do we find evidence of sexual relations, okay, with women? Is after that. These are single women. And so he's marrying them. So this is late 1842, early 1843. So, and it's like Melissa Lott said, I was only sealed to Joseph for 9 months before he was killed. And she was asked, why didn't you have any kids? She goes, well, it wasn't our fault. It just didn't happen. And anybody who's married, no, you don't get pregnant every time you have sexual relations. So the women are saying, we don't know why we weren't, but we do have evidence of two or three. See, and those we don't know their identities. So again, coming back to this, the timeline doesn't allow Joseph to have had very many kids at all. Two or three makes about the right number you'd expect. Brigham Young, on the other hand, gets to Utah in 1847, lives for 30 years with plural wives. Okay, that's a lot of time. Did he have 56? I don't know. I don't like talking about Utah polygamy. It makes me depressed. I think polygamy is not fun. I'm glad it's not expected today. I don't believe I'll ever have to be a polygamist. That it's not required for exaltation. It's just something I haven't studied, the Utah polygamy, but could be around 56. But again, he had 30 years and lots of plural wives to cohabit with in order to have all these children.
I think I remember as well, like reading in one of your articles, I think on your website, that the last couple of years of Joseph's life as well, he was extremely busy, bringing forth the temple endowment. He became mayor, the political campaigns and such. So there was a lot as well going on in his life, having to hide as well. So there's those things going on as well at this time.
Yeah, yeah. Emma was on the warpath after about, August of 43. And even though she became friendly later and may have regulated it within the Nauvoo mansion, how Joseph spent time with his wives, we have accounts from Emily Partridge saying that after the first night that they were married and Emma allowed them each, I think they must have each had a night or something, but after that, she never allowed them to stay with him again, period. So that's why Emily and Eliza didn't bear children. So really it's a good question, but the secrecy and the short, it's just 2 or 3 years that Joseph is actually practicing this in Nauvoo, would have allowed 2 or 3 children, which is what Mary Elizabeth Rawlins reported. So
another question related to this. Sorry, this is a bit all over the place, but I'm trying to tie in questions when we're on a point. One person asked, why did Brigham and Heber take plural wives at a much higher rate after Joseph's death and have much more children than in Nauvoo? And I've sort of said here, they seem to be alluding to, did they just want to get Joseph out of the picture so then they could indulge themselves in polygamy once they got to Utah. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's yeah, I think you're alluding to the conspiracy theory that Brigham orchestrated Joseph's death. And I want to be respectful here, but that has got to be the most ridiculous thing I think I've ever heard. But they do make an observation that Joseph Smith is marrying Joseph's plural wives, and there is an account that Joseph asked him to keep track of these women, and that is understandable because even though Joseph was sealed to 30 something women, he made sure all 30 of them were taken care of. They were literal wives to him. If you look at his behavior, he is caring about that. He's worried about, do they have a roof over their head? Do they have food on their table? Because he considers them his wives. And one of those considerations was, look, if I get killed, okay, you marry my plural wives and take care of them. And that was why he wanted them taken care of. And so lots of women, all of the women were offered to be sealed to Brigham, Heber, Kimball, George A. Smith, Amos Lyman. They were offered these men to be their legal husbands after Joseph's death so that they would all be taken care of. In fact, Sylvia Sessions Lyons was sealed to, was it Heber Kimball, I think, but he never lived with her. They weren't husband and wife in any literal sense at all. But it's to fulfill Joseph's admonition that all of these women be taken care of. Now, Joseph or Brigham and Hiram had more because of this, and because people wanted to be sealed to them, and they knew if they were sealed to them that eternally they should be okay, but also they'd be taken care of as they're crossing the plains. And it's interesting because in Utah, Heber C. Kimball is introducing a woman to his plural wives, and he introduces her to one or two or three, and he goes, I don't think that I'm going to introduce you to any more because I'm not sure your faith is strong enough, but I have been sealed to all of these and plenty more in Nauvoo, and I haven't seen them since, and I hope I never will.
Yeah.
And he's saying that, these women could come back and say, hey, I was sealed to you in Nauvoo. I want you to take care of me. And so, this sealing and stuff, I think it's going to be sorted out. I think, honestly, I don't think any man's going to have 30 wives in eternity, or even 15 maybe. I think a lot of these women are going to choose a different dynamic. And the key for us here is to remain worthy. Eternally, no man or woman is going to be in a marriage relationship or a marriage dynamic that they have not chosen and that they are not fully joyful with. And we just don't need to worry about it. We don't understand eternal marriage. We don't understand eternal plural marriage. We don't know what that means. So worrying about it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so whether Brigham's going to keep all of his wives in eternity, we'll wait and see. There's plenty of time during the millennium. The keys to seal are also the keys to loosen, Joseph F. Smith said. And so there can be all kinds of remodeling according to the desires of those who are worthy. So
Okay. Do you have more slides you want to go through in your presentation? I know I'm sort of asking a bunch of questions, but I'm happy if you want to keep going with your slides and I can intermingle with questions,
yeah.
or if you want to take a break, we can always come back for a second part. What are you thinking?
I just say let's march forward, and
Yeah,
if you want to break this up as part one and part two, because we're kind of mixing the two together, but it's very timely that you're asking these questions when we're discussing this data. So I like that. So and we are getting to the end here,
perfect.
and I don't have to spend too much time. The third group that are apparently in this grand conspiracy to portray Joseph as a polygamist are non-Brighamite attestations. The handout has several in there. I'm just going to show one. Leonard Sobey, he leaves the Nauvoo church. He's not affiliated with the RLDS or the Utah church. He's not going to worry about threats from Brigham Young, but he signs an affidavit in 1886 saying that he was there when the High Council read the revelation. He reads a copy of section 132 and says it's the same. I don't know if you could remember along that long, but he's validating that there was a revelation from Joseph on polygamy. Those are the key points that are validated here. And he's clearly not conspiring with anybody in the church or out of the church because he would have no motive. Or maybe the denialists can give us a motive, but I can't find one.
That's a good point, because he's saying he was present in the High Councilman meeting in August 1843. He didn't stay with the church. He's not a Brighamite. He's not a supporter of polygamy. So what would be his motive to lie about this? That's a good point.
Yeah, and Ebenezer Robinson in the handout, there's three accounts from him, James Whitehead. I'm just going to skip ahead here, but there's quite a number of people who could not be compelled by anything out of the RLDS Church or out of Utah territory to comply with conspiracy. And then the last source are RLDS sources, and I did want to spend just a minute here because I don't think these are as well known. But look at these minutes from the RLDS meeting from 1865. And these are just the minutes. And some background, the RLDS Church is formed in 1860 with Joseph Smith III as president. One of his counselors becomes William Marks. And William Marks was president of the Nauvoo High Council, Nauvoo Stake. And so he was there when Hiram read the Revelation, according to multiple accounts. And so they're talking about this in the meetings. Just read this. He says, the question arose whether Joseph the martyr taught the doctrine of polygamy. President Marks, he's a counselor, said that Brother Hiram came to his place once and told him he did not believe in it and he was going to go see Joseph about it. And if he had a revelation on the subject, he would believe it. And after that, Hiram read a revelation on it in the High Council. And he and Marks felt it was Marks, felt it was not true, but he saw the council receive it. Here we have a validation, again, from an RLDS source, William Marks, in a very good documentation. These are notes that are taken, firsthand as he's saying them or reporting this and telling us Joseph was a polygamist. I think this is quite compelling.
Yeah, he's from the RLDS church, William Marks, and he's saying that Hiram was basically like, I don't believe all these rumors about polygamy, and he said, I'm going to go to Joseph himself. And then what does it say? And Marks felt it was not true, but he saw that the council received it. So William Marks isn't denying that there was a revelation, but he just didn't accept or believe it.
Right. But see, our question here is, isn't accuracy. I believe this is very accurate. This is very good historical documentation. But the real question is, why would William Marks be in a conspiracy with Brigham Young or what? I mean, what conspiracy can wrap around this behavior by Marks, who's recounting this? And then Joseph Smith III is talking to his uncle, William B. Smith, who's saying he's going to write a biography of Joseph, his brother, Joseph Jr. And Joseph Smith III said, Father's history has not been written, but it ought to be. He says, I have long been engaged in removing from Father's memory and the early church the stigma and blame thrown upon them because of polygamy. I'm going to skip ahead here. If you are the wise man I take you to be, you will fail to remember anything contrasting to the lofty standard of the character by which we esteem these good men. Joseph Smith III is telling William, if you're going to write a biography, you should forget about polygamy. Don't talk about it. I've been working too hard to get rid of the stigma. Again, indicating Joseph Smith III knew that William knew that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And then in a letter to E.C. Brand, he says, I have been getting used to contemplating my respective stepmothers and possible half-brothers and sisters. I ask you to look after the limbs of the family tree. I want to see if they were akin to the root. And if you find any more mothers or aunts and can do so, just get proofs, anything that's offered. This is in Joseph Smith's handwriting. We don't have the previous letters, but it's really plain. And he goes through and lists the wives by name. And they converge with these earlier lists, some of which come from Joseph Smith's time period, as far as the identity of these women.
Some of these women as well. And like it said in that quote, he is pretty much considering the probability and the likelihood that he has some stepmothers that his father was a polygamist, even though he was very avid fighting against Joseph's polygamy. That's his father. So you could understand him being motivated to want to defend his character with regards to that, but it seems that even he's beginning to acknowledge and see that it's quite likely, at least that's what it's seeming like in this letter.
Perfect summary. And then in 1903, he's exchanging letters with his cousin, Joseph F. Smith, in Utah. Joseph F. Smith is the president of the Utah Church, Joseph Smith III of the RLDS Church, and their letters are being published in The Arena. This is a national publication. And Joseph Smith III said the chief contention of the reorganized church and the sons of the prophet Joseph Smith is not that he was not a polygamist, but that the dogma and practice are contrary to Scripture, ancient and modern, and wrong. So at this point,
Right.
he's not even arguing that Joseph wasn't a polygamist. He's given up that, at least for this essay. But to me, it's a tacit acknowledgement that, yeah, he knows Joseph Smith, his father, was a polygamist. And so he's not going to try and defend the position that he was not. Again, he's given up on that argument.
So
Um,
that's what Joseph F. Smith is saying about Joseph Smith III, basically that he's sort of given up on defending that argument that his father was not a polygamist, but the position of the RLDS Church is that, well, it's still wrong. It's contrary to scripture and doctrine, but he's sort of given up that fight defending that his father wasn't a polygamist.
And before we go on to the third question, just to reiterate, we've seen all these diverse sources telling the same message. Joseph was a polygamist. He did have a revelation on plural marriage. Okay, and the challenge for the denialist is not necessarily to evaluate each piece for accuracy, but to try to explain with a plausible, rational reconstruction or theory to explain their behavior. Why would Joseph Smith III write those letters? Why would William Marks give the report? Why would all of the people make the affidavits and sign the affidavits? Why would Leonard Sobey and Ebenezer Robinson, behave the way they behaved? That's the conspiracy theory that the denialists would be wise to try to create if they want their argument to be taken seriously by historians, by
And
anybody who wants to look at all of the evidence.
And even if they argue that we're not going to trust any evidence after Joseph Smith's death, you presented all the contemporary evidence as well, which you can't ignore. And I also do think that's fair to say we can't trust any later sources because, like, a lot of the polygamy deniers would still believe in Joseph Smith, and we believe in like the first vision and the priesthood restoration. I believe in those things. A lot of critics will hammer on we don't have anything contemporary written at the time, and I think it would be awesome if we did. It would be great if we had some document. Joseph wrote it. He had some sort of private journal, but Joseph didn't start writing in a journal till 1832, so that's not when we first start hearing him recording it. But when it comes to this, like there is some contemporary evidence as well before
Quite a
1845
bit.
that we have to account
Yeah.
for. Like this, from historically, this is strong evidence converging both the later sources, both people who were still in the church, affidavits from wives, also journal entries from people like Lucy Walker and Helen Mar Kimball and the Partridge sisters, as well as people who didn't follow Brigham Young, like Leonard Sobey, and just combining all that contemporary and late, there's strong evidence that it's true.
Well, and I certainly do agree with you on that. And uh,
And critics would as well. Dan Vogel would be on our side in this. John Dehlin, like usually we're sort of going against them, but on this issue, they're all in line with us as well because this is very much a historical question.
but what's also interesting because recently there was a very long video. I could only watch about a half hour of it. It was I won't mention her name, but it had something. I think it was entitled "Woe Unto You, Scribes." But it's kind of a takedown of my work and of me personally. I was surprised. I was kind of flattered that they would think that I am that much of an authority for the church. Okay, I've published and presented on this topic probably more than anybody, but I have not handed the narrative to the church. Okay, that's highly naive. The church has an army of historians with PhDs, far more qualified than me, who are looking at primary documents, not just reading my trilogy or my other writings. And they've come to the very same conclusion. Okay, the gospel
Right.
topic essay I did not write. I did review a copy about 6 months before it was released, and I made a few very small recommendations. But I was so pleased because it has a paragraph for every one of the big controversies, and many of the smaller ones are covered as well. I was very pleased with it. They took almost all of my little suggestions, if I remember right. But the point is that the historians came up with the narrative, and I know it was vetted. And I'm talking about the gospel topic essay on Kirtland and Nauvoo polygamy. That was vetted through the 12 and the first presidency. So they came up with the gospel topic essay. I gave a slight review. It was vetted through our highest leaders. So that narrative, and all the doctrine and history that it reflects is something that's coming from the church and its highest leaders. Highest leaders.
Right.
It's
Because a
not
lot of
coming
people
from
try to
Brian
attribute
Hales. Now,
that to
I'm an
you.
easy target.
Yeah, it's
Go
just the
ahead and
Brian
take
Hales
down
narrative.
Brian Hales, and you think you're taking down the church. But when you disagree with Brian Hales's version of things, you're disagreeing with Russell M. Nelson's version and everybody else and all of their historians. And this is it's kind of easy, and I get it. And I'm kind of flattered actually that I would be the guy that they would think would be so smart to give the church, the narrative, but it didn't happen that way. The church has its own narrative that it's created from its own historians and leaders. Keep in mind, Dallin H. Oakes is a co-author on a book on the martyrdom. And it
That's
doesn't
right.
talk about polygamy, but it talks all about the martyrdom, and polygamy would have been a part of that. We have people in the highest quorums of the church who are published historians and highly qualified to make judgment on these historical things. So you're not disagreeing with me if you want to believe the denialist narrative on Joseph Smith and plural marriage. You're disagreeing with our highest leaders and with the official narrative. And we'll talk about that in this third question. So this question is, do you believe church presidents Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow lied when relating their eyewitness reports of Joseph Smith introducing and practicing polygamy? And were the priesthood keys held by these four prophets passed down to Russell M. Nelson? I made this up because I don't want, we shouldn't think that you can believe Joseph was not a polygamist and still think that we are sustaining the church leadership and their teachings today. When somebody says Joseph was just a monogamist, they are also saying, even if they don't speak the words, that Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow were liars. Brigham Young said, as for polygamy or any other doctrine the Lord has revealed, it is not for me to change. John Taylor, we have received the doctrine of plural marriage as a part of the gospel. Wilford Woodruff, Joseph Smith, of course, taught that principle while in Nauvoo, and he not only taught it, but practiced it too. Lorenzo Snow, the principles of plural marriage were revealed for the benefit and exaltation of the children of men. And I could find lots more quotes, and in the handout I've got several others. But the point is that when people say that Joseph Smith was a monogamist, and they imply or state that these men are lying, and keep in mind, not only are they relating that Joseph Smith did it, they're also saying Joseph Smith told them that they were supposed to be practicing it, and they did. All of these men were polygamists during Joseph's lifetime. I think I'd have to go back to the chart, but they all were polygamists at some point. But in their term as the presiding leader of the church, president of the high priesthood, key holder, whatever we want to call that position, they allowed and personally performed plural marriage ceremonies. Now, I better clarify that. There is no plural marriage ceremony. You just do a monogamous ceremony and repeat it for the man.
Right.
And so that's how plural marriage is not a covenant or an ordinance or a ceremony or anything like that. It's just a repetition. But the point is that all of these men are using their priesthood keys to allow these to occur. And the reason that's important is because how can somebody believe in the keys being with Russell M. Nelson today? And in the handout, I have what Russell M. Nelson has said. He said that it began and ended with divine guidance, that God was there in the beginning and at the end. And Russell M. Nelson approved the gospel topic essay. He approved Saints, which tells the story of Joseph Smith introducing and practicing polygamy. And so that's what our current leaders believe. How can somebody believe that Brigham and John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow were all lying and abusing their priesthood keys and still believe that our leaders today are inspired and have true priesthood? I think that's tough. But people can believe whatever they want. And maybe the last slide, and we don't want to spend a lot of time here, and we don't want to get personal with any person. But if we look at what the definition of apostasy is, it's when people are disagreeing publicly. You can believe whatever you want. If you want to believe Joseph wasn't a polygamist and these men were lying or they weren't lying, or you want to just shelf it, whatever. Privately, we can believe whatever we want. But when we publicly start teaching things that disagree with our leaders, then you can find a pattern here that your local leaders might consider to be apostasy. But I do worry. I worry very much that that there will be people who will think that they're just embracing a new idea or a new interpretation or new evidence or new discovery, when in fact they're embracing a narrative that is going to, I've called polygamy denying a halfway house to apostasy, a way station to apostasy, because you also are accepting, even if you don't realize it at the time, the idea that subsequent leaders are lying and abusing their priesthood keys. And to me, that narrative will kill testimony. And then if these people finally realize Joseph was a polygamist and they've been indoctrinated to believe that polygamy is so bad, then you got Joseph Smith doing something that is so bad. How can you believe in him either? And so we see
Good
the
point.
danger from a faith perspective of these teachings. So and then here's an article I did if anybody's interested in the interpreter. I didn't plan to end with that, but maybe that's a good place. So if you have questions or something, we can certainly
Yeah,
move
no,
to that.
I think that's a good point because I remember I did ask Michelle whenever I interviewed her, so like if yous are right about Joseph not being a polygamist, which of course I think we've demonstrated clearly that he was, but what would be the implication for the church? And I think you're right. The implication is not just that they were mistaken, but they're claiming that Joseph Smith practiced it, he taught it and restored it. They were eyewitnesses. So if they were wrong about that, then they would be lying. And then really the implication being like the church has been led astray, that we don't have the priesthood keys, shall we say. And you're right. I think it's causing a lot of people to leave the church and apostatize as well. And then, like you said, if this debate can be shown very demonstrably historically that Joseph was a polygamist, then that will probably lead them to lose faith then maybe in Joseph Smith and possibly the restoration. So
Yeah, and that's why it isn't a benign discussion. This is why local leaders need to act, because the narrative is I think going to lead people to apostatize, as you said. And I frankly, I'll be honest, local leaders have allowed these public teachings that are critical of our current narrative, of our current leaders, to go on for a very long time. And I don't understand it, though I've never been a bishop. And so I try to not judge. These are the individuals with the keys, but it says right in the document that they local leaders should act promptly to protect others. Because if a church member is teaching, that's one thing. But if somebody's been excommunicated, who's known to be a dissenter and apostate, is teaching, that colors the teaching, I think, quite a bit. And we excommunicate people not because we're angry with them, we forgive them. D&C 6413. The reason leaders do it is they will offend God if they allow people to continue to teach falsely and they lead others astray. So a genuine concern for local leaders, public teaching of these ideas.
and it's definitely a growing movement. And in one hand, I can have some charity and understanding because whenever I was first in my faith crisis after returning from a mission, and still to this day, although I feel like I understand and have contextualized some things, polygamy is a hard thing. I remember it being really hard because I would have grown up not knowing Joseph was a polygamist, or if I did, I would have just assumed that they were just, I don't know, sailings to old widows. I'd never been taught about it, and I'd watched the Joseph Smith movie, and that was a really hard thing. And I can understand, on the one hand, why this might be appealing, that you have this really strong attachment to Joseph, and one, especially if you view, because the doctrine of polygamy can be hard, the practice of it is very messy in many aspects. So I can understand why it could be appealing to someone to want to go with this narrative that this wasn't from Joseph Smith. He didn't practice it. He's innocent of this, and just put it all onto Brigham Young. I can understand it, but I think, unfortunately, I think historically speaking, it's very clear that he was a polygamist. He was the author of Doctrine and Covenants 132, and then maybe then we can get into some of the scriptural or doctrinal or theological arguments. But I really appreciate what you've covered there and all the work and research that you've done. And I think you have been really transparent on the subject of plural marriage. I've even listened to some critics who disagree with your views or interpretations or conclusions, but are rarely critical that you have been dishonest or misleading. Your books and also your website is very transparent about it, and I think you've been very thorough in our episode today, talking about the data and evidence supporting Joseph being a polygamist. So I do appreciate that, and I think if you're siding with the polygamy deniers, you need to account for this evidence and data that's been presented.
I appreciate that. You've been very kind, and I don't know if you want to break this up for questions
Yeah,
or if we want to be done. However you want to organize it, I'm more than happy to address. There were some really good
there were
questions
some
in
really good ones.
the threads that I was reading yesterday. So
I
let's
think, would you mind
continue.
if we could pause the recording? We could end here for part one. You get a quick drink or if you need the bathroom or whatever it
Yeah,
be. And
I'll go
then the
fill
next
up.
segment could just kind of be rapid fire because some of them were good questions. I'll try not to repeat what we hashed over, but I think it would be good to address some of these questions as well. But I think we'll stop here for part one. Thanks so much, Brian, for all the work you've done. Listeners who've been watching, give this a like, comment, share so we can get this information out there so there can be more transparency when it comes to the subject, and come back for part two where we'll address a lot more of listeners' questions and more rapid fire and addressing maybe some of the scriptural or doctrinal or theological arguments about polygamy as well. So we'll see you on part two. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.